Hey everyone, today we're going to learn about 10 things about component composition in Nextjs. So basically we will talk about different composition patterns with server and client components, patterns that won't work, how to use third-party packages that use some browser API or React hooks, when to use server client components, how to share data between components, and some tips on performance. So what is component composition anyway in Nextjs? So in simple words, it's just a way to combine server and client components in Nextjs, whether you can insert one component into another component or not. So a few things you need to know about React tree and obvious pattern. So React actually uses a tree structure to render out the components just like the DOM. So in the image, you can see that we have a tree for the client components and the server components. React uses this kind of tree to render out the components, render out the UI. All these nodes are actually component, and all the nodes can have more children, and children can also have more children. That's how React actually works. And all the components in Nextjs are now server components by default. However, you can make them client component using this use client directive at the top of the file. And it's kind of obvious that you can nest server components inside server components and client components inside client components, like in the image below. So that doesn't include the 10 things that I want to talk about. So let's learn those 10 things. But before that, I'm going to assume you have some basic understanding of client components and server components. You don't have to be in advance or very experienced with them. I'm also very new. So let's see those 10 things. So first, you can insert a client component inside a server component. So in the image, all the green nodes are server component, but you can add a client component, which is this red node, and it will just work fine. You won't have any kind of problem. So let's see that in code. So I have this basic Nextjs project. I'm going to create a component inside my app. I will call it client component.jsx. And I will copy this code. Now we can insert the component in our page file, which is actually our server component. So client component. So basically we just have this button that will increment the count state, and we're rendering the count state. So I can click on this increment button and it is incrementing the state. So it's working. The second thing that you should know about is that all the components are client components when you have a client component as a parent. Since all the components are now server components, you might need to have a lot more client components. And it might be a hassle to use this use client directive on all the component file. But you don't need to use this directive if your component is already a client component. We have this client component over here, and all the components that is the children of this client component are also treated as a client component. So let's see that. I'll create another file. I'll call it client component child.jsx. I'll paste the code. So you can see I haven't added the use client directive. I will add a console log over here. Client component child, and let's add that component. As you can see, we have client component child rendered on the browser, and if I open up the console, you see we have this text client component child, the console log, but on the server we don't have that console log, which means the new component that we have created is treated as a client component, even though we didn't add this use client directive at the top. We're even importing the use state hook, which is not allowed in server component. But if I use this exact same component inside a server component, then I'll get an error. So in the page.js, I'm going to insert the client component child. Now we should have an error. And we do have an error. It says you are importing a component that needs use state. It only works in a client component. So we cannot use that component inside our server component. The third thing you should know is that you cannot insert a server component inside a client component. You will get an error. Like I mentioned previously, all the component will be treated as a client component if the parent is a client component. So you just can't simply insert a server component. Nextjs will try to use it as a client component. So let's see that in the code. I will create another component, server component.csx. I'm gonna paste some code. We'll copy this and paste here. So it's a pretty simple server component. We're just importing the FS module, which is a file system module from Node.js. It's not a browser API. So now if I import that inside our client component, we should have an error. So server component. As you can see, it says module not found, cannot resolve FS. Basically, it's trying to get the FS module from the client side, but the FS module lives only on the server in the Node.js environment, not in a browser environment. So you cannot use a server component inside a client component, but you can simply use it on a server component. I have to undo the changes over here. As you can see, it's working fine. Now the fourth thing is that you can pass a server component as a prop to the client component. So even though I mentioned that you cannot use a server component inside a client component, you can still pass a server component as a prop to the client component. This pattern is really useful when you have some kind of provider like React Context or Redux provider. You want to wrap your entire app or some part of your app by that provider. You can simply do that in the layout.js file over here, which is kind of the root file of our app. But React Context or other providers uses state, and context and any kind of state is not available in server component. So you have two options. You can make the main layout file a client component using the use client directive, which is not recommended because it will make all of your component a client component. Or you can create a separate client component for your provider and pass your server component as a children or as a prop. So here's how it works. Actually, let me just show you in the code. I will copy this piece of code. I'll create a new component, provider.jsx. I'll paste the code. So this is a client component. We have this directive. We have this React context. We are expecting a children as our prop. Then we have some state, some functions, and then we are returning the app context provider and rendering out the children over here. So now we can go to the layout.js file, import that provider. Now we can wrap our children by that provider. The children is actually going to be all the page components, which are going to be server components. And we are passing the server component as a children prop. So let's see. Even if I just refresh the page, we don't see any kind of error. However, you can only able to consume the context values from a client component, not a server component. So the fifth thing you should know about that, you should keep the server-only code to server component. So for example, sometimes you might need to write some server-only code like fetching data from database, reading files, and so on. You should keep those files in server components on server side, but it could be the case that accidentally you might use this code in client components. For example, let's see this code. We have this get data function, which fetches some data from an API endpoint, which needs an authorization header, which is coming from a secret API key stored in an environment variable. If you use this on the server side, it will work totally fine, but you accidentally might use this function in a client component. In that case, it won't work. you might end up exposing any kind of secret information to the client side, which you don't want. However, Nextjs will make the environment variable value to an empty string if you don't put the next public. It is for security purposes. To avoid this kind of situation, you can use a package called server only. You just need to import that at the top of your file, and during the build time, you will get an error. So let's see how it works. So first I'm gonna create a new file, get data.js. I will copy this code. Let's install the package npm I server only. Now let's use this getData function inside our client component, and you should see an error. So client component, let's call the getData function. And here you have an error. You are importing a component that needs server only, that only works in a server component, but one of its parent is marked with use client, so it's a client component. So the server only package will prevent these accidental issues. And like server only, there is also a package called client only, which does the exact same thing, but for the client components. Now let's see more stuff. So the sixth thing you should know is that you can pass server data to a client component. So it could be the case you are fetching some data from a database for your server component, but your client component might also need those data. So you can pass those data as a prop to the client component instead of fetching the data again on the client side. The data that you will be passing should be serializable. You can pass string, number, booleans, array, objects. However, you cannot pass some other stuff like JSX, functions that are not server action. You can check everything from the React documentation. So the serializable data types are these, and these like React elements, JSX, classes, functions, these are not serializable, so you won't be able to use it. The seventh thing you should know is that you can share data between server components using a single request. So suppose you have a server component 1, which is fetching some data, and you have a server component 2 that needs the exact same data. So you might be fetching the data again for the server component 2. So if you use the fetch function, React will automatically cache your response. So on component 2, when you use the fetch function again, it won't send another request. It will use the cache data, like you can see from this example. We are calling the fetch function twice, but it is sending a request only once. On the second time, it is using the cache data. The eighth thing you should know is that you cannot use any browser APIs in server components like window, document, local storage. These things are not available on a server environment. You cannot even use any kind of hooks like useState, useEffect, React context, nothing, because server component doesn't come with JavaScript. The ninth thing you should know is that the third-party packages that uses browser API or some kind of React hooks won't actually work by default if you try to use them in a server component. So for example, we are importing a component from some package, and this component actually uses the useState hook behind the scenes. So if you try to use it directly inside a server component, you will have an error. So you have two choices. You can use that component inside another client component and then use that client component inside a server component, or you can create another file, add the use client directive, and re-export the exact same component that you want to use, and then you can use this component, the newly exported component, inside of your server component, and that should work. The 10th thing you should know is that you should move your client component down the tree. The server components are cheap and faster to send to the browser because they don't have JavaScript or have minimal JavaScript. But the client components are opposite since they can have interactivity. And like I mentioned before, once you have a client component, all of its children will be treated as a client component. So for example, if you put the client component at the top of your tree, for example here, then all of the components that is children will be treated as a client component, even though they don't need to be a client component. They can just be a simple server component. And client components had JavaScript, it will increase the bundle size. And if you use the client components at the top of your tree, then it will increase the bundle size more, which can affect the performance. So this is considered bad, but it still depends on the situation. You might need to use client components closer to the top of your tree, but if you can avoid it, please do it. This can be considered a good pattern. The client components is used at the bottom of the tree. So that's it. These are the 10 things that you should know about server components and client component composition. I hope this video has been helpful for you. If it was, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. It really motivates me to create more components like this. You can also let me know what type of content you want to see next on this channel. You can also follow me on LinkedIn or Twitter as thatanjan. And I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.